One of the most controversial subjects that probably shouldn't be controversial is protein. I have Dr. Gabrielle Lyon here. We're going to talk about the most ludicrous protein myths that are out there. Why don't you lead off with number one?
Number one is protein is bad for your bone. We are still hearing that to this day. The dietary protein is bad for your bone. And the reality is what do you think bone is made from?
Protein.
That's right. And when I was in my geriatric training, we saw that those individuals with the lowest protein intake had the highest risk of fracture, hip fractures. The idea that protein is bad for your bone, I mean, that has been totally disproven. There's multiple meta-analyses that show the importance of dietary protein on bone health overall. So that's number one. Number two, my most favorite, which this one really dies hard. Do you know what it is?
I did put a link down below if you like good steak for ButcherBox. Steak and eggs is arguably one of the best breakfasts that you can have. If you look at the bodies of research I look at, and I could be biased, okay, but I like steak and eggs. I also like ground beef and eggs. That is a tremendous breakfast. It's calorically dense. I get my calories in the morning, and it's amazing. So I put a link down below for ButcherBox where you can get grass-fed, grass-finished beef. Their grass-fed, grass-finished ground beef and bison is like amazing, and their fillets are unreal, but they don't just have red meat. They have steak, they have chicken, they have scallops, they have pork, they have everything you could think of. They have bacon, they have hot dogs that are grass-fed, grass-finished. They have it all. Indulge in breakfast. Enjoy the food in breakfast. Then you can relax and you can be in control a little bit more throughout the rest of the day. No.
Protein is bad for the kidneys.
Okay, of course.
Right, so there's also been multiple meta-analyses about this. I think Stu Phillips just published one. Protein actually has been shown to improve glomerular filtration rate, so the way in which the kidneys process. So there is no evidence to support that healthy kidneys, that dietary protein is an issue for healthy kidneys.
If I jump back really quick even to number one.
Yeah.
Like, why did we come to this conclusion on the bones? Because is it, I mean, the first thing comes was there lobbying for the dairy industry back in the day where we were just pushing calcium? But even then,
no,
it's like
I think that there's
urinary.
I think it came from this urinary excretion of calcium that when individuals, and again, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that when they tested it, when people were increasing protein, there was an increase in urinary excretion of calcium.
Which dovetails into number two anyway, right? Because maybe they're thinking, okay, that's going to affect glomerular filtration rate because you're excreting, minerals and it's build up. That's interesting because it's just it makes no logical sense today, right? Because most foods that are rich in calcium, and you think when I was growing up, we were just taught that calcium for bones, right? Obviously that's not where I stand now. I'm not just going to go down calcium to try to increase my bone density.
Yeah.
However, very seldom are you going to find in at least the dairy category calcium without full spectrum protein too. So I'm like, okay, yeah, that's probably the issue there. And then from the kidney perspective, yes, that one is very difficult to overcome for people. It's just still to this day, I have people on the daily commenting on my videos that have said, my doctor's telling me to reduce my protein intake because it's stressing my kidneys.
Yeah, and that is long been disproven, but again, it's a narrative that dies hard. The other thing I would love to point out is that when you think about kidney health, what do you think can be very toxic to kidneys at a high level? Carbohydrates. Diabetes can destroy kidneys.
Yeah.
Elevated levels of blood sugar. Not dietary protein.
Well, especially when you think of protein as a regenerative tool, right?
Yes.
Cell turnover is pretty rapid in kidney cells, right? That's right. Yep. So it's if you think about it even from a protein perspective and building and repairing, I think people forget the fundamental piece there, not just for organ health, for muscle and everything, having that little bit of that mTOR spike that we need for proper repair. Are we just gonna starve ourselves until the organs aren't functioning? Is that the goal?
Yeah, I think that again, having a healthy body composition, prioritizing protein, having a protein-forward nutrition plan is the best for all organ systems in your body.
Is there any sort of situation that you can think of where, reducing protein would be beneficial, as far as kidneys are concerned?
If someone, and I'm not a nephrologist, so I don't know, but depending on the severity of kidney disease, potentially.
Yeah.
Depending, and I will say that there is one spectrum where I would say reducing dietary protein would be beneficial, but that's not a myth.
Yeah.
So I won't go there.
Okay. All right, let's move on to number 3 in this case.
Yeah. Number 3 is that you need less protein the older you get. I hear that all the time. You actually need more protein as you age because skeletal muscle has this aging phenomenon that's called anabolic resistance, meaning that the efficiency of the muscle to sense protein, dietary protein, utilize dietary protein goes down. As an individual ages, you actually need more protein than less protein. And there's a great position paper called the ProDage paper. ProDage position paper, it came out in 2013, and it's just phenomenal.
So essentially, I mean, in very layman's terms, like as you get older, it's
you
just
need more
harder
dietary protein.
Yeah.
Because you have to protect skeletal muscle, and the tissue needs dietary protein to mount that response.
Is it just because muscle protein breakdown is increasing as you get older, or is it double whammy with that in tandem with muscle protein synthesis also being more difficult to initiate?
That's a great question. Muscle protein breakdown is difficult to measure, but we know that protein synthesis declines as individuals age, and they require a threshold. They require this leucine threshold to stimulate tissue. I have gone back and forth in my own mind, is it an aging phenomenon or is it that the skeletal muscle is untrained? Because what we see is that when individuals train and then you add in a lower dose of protein, that tissue has a robust response like it would as a younger individual.
So by untrained, do you mean untrained?
Sedentary.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you meant untrained as in like less stimulus from protein, like conditioning for uptake.
So I mean, I think that there's more work to be done in that area, but as it stands right now, as individuals age, they need more protein.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed like in some of the literature I've seen that like phosphorylation of, P70S6K tends to kind of decline, meaning that like, but it also, just like you said, it also tends to align right with when people start to become more sedentary too. So it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yes.
Like we start to see that, like I published a video a while back on this, so it's kind of interesting. Like you look at like after age 50, you see, okay, all these rates of disease go up, all this, rates of, or activity levels go down. But in that same vein, there's also all these confounders that come in as to why they're more sedentary. They're retired, so they're not up and moving around as much. So there's all these things, like which really came first? Like if we're just moving after age 50 more and making a concerted effort to be as active in our 50s as we were in our 40s or our 30s, and we put our minds there, then maybe we don't see these declines in, AKT signaling or P70S6K phosphorylation, all these things that...
I think that there's a lot of potential there, and the majority of the individuals are not as active as they need to be. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we would see a change in signaling, and it wouldn't be kind of this, what we think of as this kind of global aging phenomenon.
Do you think that and this could be theoretical, but I'm curious your take on it because it's just interesting to talk about this. Does the body potentially become better at muscle protein synthesis if it's more conditioned to a higher protein diet? Because you look at things like the glucose tolerance is a perfect example, right? Like if you consume a fair amount of glucose, but you also burn it, you have this sort of turnover, like you essentially become more glucose tolerant. And whereas if you were to like say go on a low carb diet, super low carb diet for 6 months or a year, you could become somewhat glucose intolerant, where temporarily you're not as good at utilizing glucose. And if you were to have a bolus of glucose, your tolerance would be not as good. There's nothing measuring this with protein. So this is pure theory, but based on kind of what you think, do you think there's something there, like where we get used to having more protein, our body just becomes more efficient at those systems?
I mean, I do think that because of the enzymatic breakdown and because of the cellular response, I do think that that is absolutely potential. I think where we see it differently is that when someone is on a lower protein diet, it takes them a little bit to adjust to a higher protein diet. And I'm not talking about mentally, but physiologically.
Well, especially digestively. That's one thing that is, I can't say is very clear scientifically, but very evident based upon like when you talk to people that all of a sudden they increase their protein and they're like, oh, I'm gassy, I'm bloated. So clearly there's something, right? Like there's something like, because so much just happens in the gut. Like maybe you're just lacking the bromelain or like some of the certain enzymes that are required there. But that's always got me fascinated. Like if we're getting a response here, then what's happening here that we're not seeing, right? And it's, I've been consuming a very high protein diet for a very long period of time. My blood work is right smack where it needs to be. And I think that my body just thrives on it. Like if I reduce my protein intake, I don't feel like myself.
Yeah, and also if you were to kind of balance that with the perspective of glucose, there's no safety mechanism needed. For example, if blood glucose gets too high, you release insulin. There's no safety mechanism like that for protein. There's not a upper limit that we know of.
Interesting, which sort of implies that like we can go a lot more than maybe we think.
That's right, and I mean, potentially, there isn't an upper limit that they know of.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And there's no counter mechanism to say, hey, this is too high. Versus with glucose, if blood sugar gets too high, you create a whole cascade of responses.
Interesting.
But we don't have that with dietary protein.
Okay, here's a myth that I'm going to propose to you because I'm curious your answer on it. There's a lot of people that will say that higher protein diets are going to lead, there's a lot of people that say that higher protein diets are going to increase the risk of advanced glycation end products. Because, more protein, that's going to be more protein that can be glycated. Is that anything to be concerned with?
I haven't seen evidence of that.
Yeah, me neither.
I haven't seen any evidence in any meaningful way to support that.
Yeah,
I'd be much more concerned with excess calories and excess carbohydrates and other processed foods than I would dietary protein.
What about some myths surrounding even timing of protein? Or let's put this into a different sense. If someone's trying to build muscle, there are a lot of people out there that will say calories are the most important thing for building muscle. I tend to disagree and think that the literature that I've seen suggests that protein might be even more important. What's your take on that?
So the hierarchy would be dietary protein. Okay. That is required to build muscle. And then does an individual need a calorie surplus? It seems that some people do and some people don't. But making sure that dietary protein is where it needs to be is really important. And for muscle building, again, it depends. Could you go higher than 1 gram per pound ideal body weight? You could. Are you going to get a massive impact if you go above that? I'm not necessarily sure that it makes a difference as long as calories are in check.
Yeah. And if you look at, I think a lot of people are lacking the appropriate stimulus as well.
Yes.
They don't realize
you cannot just eat protein. The only way you would build or gain any kind of muscle is if you were protein deficient. You cannot just eat protein and then build muscle.
Well, and that's where actually the longevity literature gets kind of interesting too, because we have this discussion about, protein's bad for longevity, which is kind of another myth that I guess we can talk about here.
In what sense?
But when you look at the literature, once again, you see that the only time that there could even be a fragment of an argument there is if there is no demand for protein. So it's if someone's not training at all and they're going above and beyond, and even then it's very weak. But it's once there is even remote stimulus, it seems as though the sky's kind of the limit. So it's unless you're basically bedridden and pounding protein, then maybe you could make an argument that maybe that doesn't make sense. But even then,
it's protective.
Yeah,
it's shown. So if someone is on bed rest, they can lose up to 2 pounds of muscle, whether they are young or old.
In how long?
In 5 to 7 days.
Holy cow.
At bed rest. And this came out of Galveston,
Whoa.
the Galveston group, Doug Patton-Jones and now Emily Lentz. And it could be 5 to 7 days. They could lose 2 pounds.
Now, is it protective?
Only for a week. Leucine is protective only for a week, which is concerning. It's concerning.
So after a week, it's not going to really have much of an effect?
It doesn't have as protective as an effect as we would hope it to.
So if you are, wow, this is cool. So because one of my, as a meathead, if I get sick.
As a very intelligent meathead, yeah.
I wouldn't go that far. But if I get sick or something, and I'm on the couch and I'm laid up, it's always been my intuition to pound the protein.
You should.
Because I'm just I'm sitting here thinking I'm losing my gains. No, it's another day. That's where my head is at in my feeble mind. And that's kind of been my intuition. It's I guess if I can increase my protein, which I guess dovetails into another question, and I want to kind of talk more about that, but if you are sick, does protein demand increase?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's a really good point because the way that everything is set up, like the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, if you get sick, the recommended dietary allowance for vitamin C is 60 milligrams. If you were to get sick, would you take more vitamin C?
Well, typically I do, but
yeah you typically would.
Yeah.
The protein recommendation is 0.37 grams per pound. If you got sick, people should think, I probably need more protein.
Yeah.
They never do. They never do.
No, most of the time they're going to the carbs at that rate. Yeah.
So yes, when you are in a highly catabolic state or when your body is under inflammation or has inflammation, protein, these amino acids, these building blocks help with repair and rebuilding all tissue. The body turns over anywhere from 250 to 350 grams of protein a day.
No kidding.
Yes. And so one of the things that happens with aging is individuals are not able to keep up with that demand.
Yeah.
And if you are sick and you are aging, that's another reason why high protein is really important. And when we say high protein, I think we should also qualify that. That is all in comparison to the RDA.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about high protein,
it's not much.
Right. So what are we talking about? We're talking about double the RDA, which is closer to 0.7 grams of protein per 1 pound.
Yeah.
And that's what we're calling high protein. Again, these definitions are so fluid. Well, what is actually really high protein? High protein is probably 1.5 grams per pound.
Yeah.
So I would say optimal protein is probably 0.7 to 1 gram per pound, ideal body weight. That's probably, or total, ideal body weight. That's probably optimal. And then a high protein diet would be 1.5 grams of protein per pound.
How much protein do you consume a day?
I'm a very tiny person, so I'm at 120 grams.
Yeah, but for your size, that's
a lot. I don't weigh 120 pounds.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I was trying...
And I probably weigh less after our workout now.
You probably catabolized quite a little bit. But I had a plan, make you look weaker, make me look stronger. I think, when I was, trying to put on as much muscle as I could, like I was upwards of 300 grams of protein per day, right? Like, so it was, and I had very little side effects with that personally. I mean, granted, when I was doing that, I was in my 20s, I was like young and probably resilient. I don't think I digestively would handle that very well right now. I feel like I'd probably be pretty bloated, but on average, like I'm still about 200 grams per day, right? And that's more than I weigh 180. So, and if I drop below 180, 170, I feel it. Like I actually start to feel it. I feel like I'm not mentally as sharp. Maybe I'm just placebo affecting myself with that. But.
Well, I don't think so because we talk about protein because we're talking about dietary health or we're talking about muscle health. But again, we're talking about protein generically, right? But it's made up of these 20 different amino acids. Phenylalanine is important for dopamine production. Tryptophan is important for serotonin production. Threonine is important for mucin production. Arginine is important for NO2 production, for nitric oxide. So we hit the target of skeletal muscle, and by doing that, everything else health-wise falls into place. So it's of no surprise to me that you don't quite feel like yourself in that way. And I think if we shift somewhat the perspective of protein generically and understand that it's 20 different nutrients, that becomes really important.
That's a good point. Yeah, 20 different nutrients that
all have different needs. They're all different needs.
Can combine with one another to make how many hundreds of thousands of combinations, right? So, and it's interesting because I've thought for a while or theorized for a while that there's almost an axis between the muscle and the brain as well. Like we know there's myokines, all this, right? Which throughout exercise can have an impact potentially on the brain. And we've got signaling devices and lactate and things like that. But I've also theorized that when you are a heavily muscled person or have good amount of muscle density or mass in general, and you're not meeting protein requirements, that perhaps there's even fundamental signaling that is disrupted, right? Because you are at a various rate, like you're entering muscle protein breakdown that is exceeding your synthesis.
Yeah.
And that's gotta signal something to your body, right? Like you're in a time of catabolism. Like I can't help but think that when you are catabolizing muscle, that it's sending some kind of signal to your brain saying, alarm, alarm, this is not good, right? I just don't know what it could be doing, but it just makes logical sense.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that I don't have any literature to back that up, but it seems like meeting your protein threshold is probably pretty important for survival, and your body would recognize that.
I mean, it's an essential nutrient. You don't need carbohydrates. Your bodies can generate carbohydrates. You need a very small amount of fat, essential fatty acids. You require protein for nearly everything.
What's your stance on protein turning to fat?
I mean, that's pretty difficult to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the literature, at least some of the recent research I was looking at, Jose Antonio had a great study, an overfeeding study, 3.4 grams per kilogram of protein. And the individuals at the higher level of dietary protein lost weight. I'm sure you've seen those studies, the protein overfeeding studies.
Yeah, and it's, when I talked to Dr. Lane Norton about this, we kind of went back and forth on it a little bit, and he sort of alluded to the fact that his theory on it, because it's still not clear, is that like the only thing that excess protein could do is, in an overfeeding sense, the protein itself isn't contributing to fat, but maybe excess protein is putting carbohydrates on the back burner, so maybe those carbohydrates can store more as fat. But that would be the only potential thing, and it's in an overfeeding situation.
Right.
Like if you are eucaloric and you get to where you should be, then like if your protein, if your calories are met via protein, it's all fine and dandy. Like you're not going to store. You could eat, if it meets your caloric needs to eat 1,000 grams of protein, then it's probably not going to store as fat because you still met your caloric needs. And maybe if you were to eat those, X number of grams of protein to meet your caloric needs, and then you put 100 grams of carbs on top of that, then maybe something would happen. But it wouldn't be because the protein's converting to fat. It's because you've already met your needs and the carbs are turning to fat.
Yeah. I would say that that is a reasonable thought process.
Okay, so to wrap this one up, we've got plant-based viewers and animal-based viewers, and omnivorous viewers. And there's a lot of people in the plant-based community that think that they are going to follow the same protein requirements as someone that eats animal-based. And sometimes it gets spun with a negative connotation when people say, hey, if you're plant-based, like you're not eating enough protein. And people will get defensive and say, no, I'm eating enough protein. I'm getting my protein from this and that. But is it true that people that are on a plant-based diet actually need to eat more actual protein?
Yes, they do. And I love that you bring this up. If you're on a plant-based diet, it would be safe to say that you need more protein. A great target to shoot for is doubling the RDA. So that would be 1.6 grams per kg.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really important point, because I was looking at some data, and the average vegan intake of protein is around 60 to 68 grams.
Oh, wow.
And so by doubling, they're really focusing on protein, and then also by doubling their protein, they'll hit their amino acid needs. So I think that's a great plan.
So is it just because of the quality of the amino acids?
Yes, it's the quality of the protein.
So yeah, and I can understand how like they might get defensive with that, because it's like if this is their lifestyle, and then you're coming at them saying, oh, well, your protein, your amino acid quality is lower. Yeah, that's.
But that's okay, because a phytonutrient on a carnivore diet would be lower too.
Exactly.
So it's
Yeah, it's just the way it is.
Any nutrition plan is going to have positives, potentially, or more nutrients from one family than another family.
Yeah, well, case in point, like for years and years, I was on a very strict ketogenic diet, and micronutrient deficiency was something that I actually had to pay attention to. Like if I just ate the meat and cheese and the fats and stuff like that, like next thing I know, like there's all these micronutrient deficiencies if I wasn't paying, I needed to make a concerted effort to almost eat twice the amount of vegetables on a ketogenic diet than I would eat on a non-ketogenic diet, because I wasn't getting the fruits, I wasn't getting, some of the grains and things like that, where I was getting a plethora of different vitamins and minerals. So I'm like, shoot, I gotta double my leafy green intake. It doesn't mean there's anything bad, it's just being cognizant of the diet you're doing.
I think that's a great strategy.
Okay, so where can everyone find you, Dr. Lyon?
You can find me on my Instagram, drgabriellelyon.com, my YouTube channel, which I don't think I've mentioned, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and my website, same name, great newsletter. I have a great podcast and a new book coming out called Forever Strong.
Perfect. We'll link out to that down below.
Thanks.
So as always, keep it locked in here on the channel. And Dr. Lyon, thank you.